Hani Bojo Kinawaya, Darrel Manitoba Wikwam Kong Donjaba. Hello everyone, my name is Darrel Manitowabi. I'm a citizen of Wikwamkong, unceded territory on Manitoulin Island, Ontario. And today I'm going to talk about wise practices in Indigenous education, employment and health, a framework for reconciliation, doing the real work of Truth and Reconciliation Spark Network 2020. And before I begin any further, I'll just situate the context in which I speak. So I'm an academic and I will talk about issues within an academic framework. However, I will provide a translation as to its meaning for an understanding of reconciliation as a practice in the everyday. Next, we'll give a presentation overview. So I will today talk about an Indigenous people's perspective on education. I will also talk about how education is a determinant of employment and health. I will give an Anishinaabe case study, and I will talk about colonial policies in education and decolonial policies in education. And the central argument I will provide here today is that in order to achieve reconciliation, we must engage upon wise practices in Indigenous education. And I'd like to just emphasize that we all are agents in education. So we educate, we are part of an educational system formally, but we also educate informally by teaching our peers about how things are. And so education is applicable to everyone in all contexts, in time and place. So I first will begin with an Indigenous perspective when I talk about what wise practices mean. So I'm speaking from an Anishinaabe perspective, and I will talk about a bit more about what Anishinaabe means in the next slide. But first, let me begin with what's referred to as Indigenous knowledge, which is really ideas that exist within an Anishinaabe understanding of things. So within the Anishinaabe language, also known as Anishinaabemowin, there's a phrase that is known as Wewene Jichkewin or Wewene Jichke, which means to do something well. And I will break down this word just to emphasize what its meaning is. So the first part of this word is Wewene, which is defined as properly, good, well, or thorough. The second part of this word is Jichkewin, which is that which is done. So Jichkewin makes it a noun. However, when you express it as a verb, it means Jichke, to do something. Wise practices within the literature, and I'm talking about the academic literature. Wise practices recognizes that there is Indigenous diversity and variation that is locally specific. So this idea of wise practices is articulated as a comparative term to good practices or best practices. So you may have heard about best practices. So best practices usually means that there is one best way to do something. It assumes that there is universalism, that everyone is the same, all instances are the same. However, within an Indigenous framework, this is not the case, and therefore we talk about wise practices that recognizes that there are locally specific differences. And within an Indigenous framework, then I will be talking about an Anishinaabe perspective, and I don't suggest that the Anishinaabe way is the same across the board, because again, if I engage with wise practices, I am recognizing explicitly that there is diversity and variation, and that one must understand that local variation in order to understand what the locally specific wise practice is. So within this framework, then, I am suggesting that Wewene is an Anishinaabe wise practice, and it is an experiential and relational Indigenous perspective about being and seeing in this world. Next, I talk about an Anishinaabe case study, education, livelihood, and health. And so back to what Anishinaabe means. So Anishinaabe, a more common definition is people or good person. And there are varying definitions. Some of them are more complex than others, but I've chosen some that are common and more understood more generally. And so the singular term Anishinaabe means one, and if you add the suffix k, it makes it plural. So Anishinaabe means the people, or the Anishinaabe people, and Anishinaabe just simply means one person. So that's important to note because you'll see different varying spellings of that term. It's also important to note too that there are varying ways of spelling Anishinaabe, and I have chosen one that is common in the region of Manitoulin Island in northeastern Ontario. So I'll talk about Anishinaabe education just to give an example of how this plays itself out within an Anishinaabe framework or wise practice. So I will talk about how Anishinaabe education existed in pre-colonial times. And so when I talk about pre-colonial times, I'm talking about a time in which the Anishinaabe people lived their lives according to how they chose to live their lives and not according to how others instructed them to live their lives. And essentially, this is a time before the loss of land through colonization and the introduction of new systems that are with us here today. So I will begin with this idea that within Anishinaabe society, autonomy was very important. And so what autonomy means that it means that each person is free to do as they choose and that others do not have a right to impose their will on another person. It respected the agency and ability of an individual to control their own lives and to contribute to society in ways that they best saw fit. And so that's a very important feature of early Anishinaabe society in pre-colonial times. It was also egalitarian. And so egalitarian means equal. And when I say this, I mean relatively equal. It's almost impossible to see pure equality. However, egalitarianism or equalness was a guiding framework that it basically meant that each person has a right to actually be treated equally as others. And in this sense, then there were um, no class systems or no social hierarchies. There were individuals who were noted for their knowledge, by way of instance, elders or medicine men. However, they were, or medicine women or healers. They were not, however, um, they were not given or empowered the ability to impose ideas on other people. And of course, this is a bit complex, but it's essentially this idea that by way of living, we must treat each other equal. And the way of living was trying to achieve that equality. Gendered livelihood certainly was the case in pre-colonial society, so it depended on your gender. So if you were male, female, or two-spirited, you had expectations in society, and that determined the roles in which you had in life, and so it situated your identity within society. And within this all-encompassing framework, ontology is a way of understanding how we see ourselves in this world and see ourselves in this universe. So within an indigenous perspective and being Anishinaabe, one sees themselves as being part of nature. So not one is not outside of nature, but one is within nature. And within this idea, then the land, water, and sky are beings, they're spirit beings, and we live in relation to them. And quite often, these ideas are expressed in relatively simplistic terms, as though there's no real complexity to them. However, there is indeed complexity. There are stories in the oral tradition about land beings, water beings, sky beings, and there is a spiritual power associated with these beings. And one can understand what this means by being out in nature. So if you're in the season that is the cooler parts of the season, you can actually feel the coldness in the environment. And when you're underwater, you can actually feel it. When you're in the water, you can feel it, and you can see the sky. And when you see thunderstorms approaching, there's an actual power associated with this characteristic of the environment. And so this is what this means then, is that we live within this environment and our relationship exists within this environment. In terms of how to live life, one of the philosophies of the Anishinaabe is Minopamadzuin. Mino means good, Pamadzuin means to live, to move along in this world. And a common definition is good life or to live well. And what I've done here is I've provided here a sketch of what this means. And so basically what I've sketched here is a Medean teaching. The Mede is a healing tradition of the Anishinaabe. It's a healing society. And basically this teaching shows that we enter this world in the east and we exit this world in the west. And essentially our bodies are shells that contain our spirit. And as we move through this world, we go through various stages. And during these stages of life, each is characterized by some challenges or temptations. And the goal of achieving the good life, which is a full life, is to overcome these temptations and to navigate these stages in life. And this is why this sketch here is not a perfect line. It just shows that there are varying stages in life and that we must overcome them. And if we are unable to overcome them, then we may exit this life through those forces of life themselves. So I next move on to talking about colonization. So colonization begins with the treaty process, which basically meant that Indigenous peoples lost title to land and were relegated to reserves. And essentially, this disrupted the connection to environment that I've talked about in the earlier slide. You could imagine that, obviously Canada is a large land body, and when you restrict access to most of it, almost all of it, then you are restricting access to these kinds of experiences and knowledges that are associated with this connection to land. In the region in which I speak, which is Manitoulin North Shore area of northeastern Ontario, the treaty was Robinson Huron and it was signed in 1850. Another significant part of colonization is the Indian Act of Canada, which is a political legislation that essentially controls the way of living and guides the way of living for Indigenous peoples in Canada, which is essentially restricting. It began in 1876 and it is still in effect to the present, and you can read all about it. If you Google Indian Act of Canada, you can actually read what it means. And essentially, this applies to First Nations in Canada that do not have local mechanisms of self government. I next move on to residential schools, which is tied into the topic of my presentation here, which essentially transformed education. So all of what I described earlier in the previous slide was disrupted through residential schools. So residential schools were essentially designed and intended for assimilation. They existed in Canada from 1880 to 1996. In northeastern Ontario, the region which I am speaking from, the Anishinaabe either attended the Spanish residential school, which is in the town of Spanish, which operated from 1913 to 1965, or they attended the Shingwauk residential school, which was in Sault Ste. Marie, and it was in operation from 1873 to 1970. And you could see here a picture of the girls' school of the Spanish residential school in the image here. I next move on to decolonization policies. So Indigenous peoples have always been active in survival, and essentially decolonization is a process by which Indigenous peoples seek survival into the future by trying to undo the legacy of colonization. And one of the first significant steps towards this is a document in 1972 called Indian Control of Indian Education, essentially advocating for the first time that Indigenous peoples need to control their education. And residential schools obviously had an intended consequence of assimilation. They were run by the church and government, and Indigenous peoples had no control over that process. And so Indian control of Indian education was a first step to decolonization as a guiding framework in decolonization. The next important document is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, released in 1996. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples essentially examined the relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada. It was largely a result of the Oka crisis that occurred in the 1990s, and essentially the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples advocated for more Indigenous control and Indigenous self-determination in areas such as education and other areas as well. Another significant document is a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which advocates Indigenous self-determination in all aspects and basically recognizes that Indigenous peoples are important and they should not be subject to forced assimilation, and therefore we must recognize that Indigenous knowledge and the autonomy of Indigenous peoples is important as a human rights issue, and released this declaration in 2007. And you can read about what this means and all about it on the internet if you Google this term, or you could also Google UNDRIP, which is the acronym for for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the reason why we are gathered to listen about these presentations, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released calls to action in 2015. Calls to action 10 talk about changes to curriculum, inclusion of language, and attaining equal funding and attaining equal education and employment as a, as a requirement of achieving reconciliation. Essentially, the TRC, which is the acronym that it is known by, was a response to the legacy of residential schools. So I spoke about residential schools earlier in this presentation, and it was intended to really undo the effects of it. And so this is a guiding framework. And again, you can read about this on the internet by Googling that term, and you will come across it. So, what is the current state of things today? And so, I'm citing some Statistics Canada statistics to show what it looks like, the situation. So, in terms of population, the population of Indigenous peoples is approximately 977,230. The unemployment rate is 11.7% versus 5.6% for all of Canada. The completion of high school is 69% for Indigenous peoples versus 77%. So that gap is not as significant as it once was. So it's an indication that things have improved. Higher education leads to better employment of Indigenous youth, according to a statistical analysis undertaken by StatsCan in 2018. In a report by StatsCan, they also cited that Indigenous youth have reported poor health outcomes. And so essentially what the statistics show in these studies is that there's a discrepancy of outcomes for Indigenous peoples. And much of the literature suggests that these are all byproducts of the colonial process and unequal treatment in society of Indigenous peoples. So what does this mean and how do we move forward? And there is a literature that shows that education is a determinant of health. And the reason being is that if you do not have sufficient education, then there is a highly likelihood that you will not be gainfully employed. And if you're not gainfully employed, you will have difficulty supporting yourself in this life. And it also leads to poor health because it can lead to a stressful life, and it can also lead to a sense of no purpose in life, and it can lead to substance abuse, which acts as a way of masking or treating this sense of loss in life and loss of purpose. So if we compare and contrast this to pre-colonial education, as I alluded to, every person in the Indigenous society in pre-colonial times was educated, and this education took the form of a vision quest. And in this vision quest, individuals understood their role in life and their purpose in life, and they all made a contribution to it. And so this kind of stress wasn't present in the past. There is a literature by the United Nations in relation to sustainable development, and they've released a document called the United Nations Sustainable Goals, which really looks at global issues of poverty and global health issues. And one of the significant sustainable goals within this discourse of sustainability and development is education and equity. So the United Nations identifies that educational disparities lead to inequities, and in order to achieve equity globally, we must invest in education. And this also is applicable to Indigenous peoples. The UN Sustainable Goals explicitly identifies that Indigenous peoples experience disproportionate educational outcomes leading to inequities. Again, I've already talked about UNDRIP and the TRC. Both of these documents call for a decolonization of education as a pathway forward to reconciliation. Therefore, education plays a significant role in this process of achieving reconciliation. Again, returning to the term I expressed earlier, Wawena Ijishkewin is decolonizing education. So basically, it seeks a sense of equity and appropriate investments in infrastructure and resources for education in pre-colonial times and in Indigenous society, and in fact in all societies. Education is a feature. It might not be education as we recognize it today. However, Education is a process by which individuals in a society are enculturated into ways of understanding and being and contributing to society. And when we have unequal investments in education, then we are not equitably treating members of a society. And so within this Wewene Ejechkewen framework, then, in order to achieve reconciliation, we must invest in education. And even within the context of education, we must, as the guiding framework of the TRC calls, we must recognize language, knowledge, and investment and equity as being something that we can achieve by decolonizing the educational structure. What are the implications? So, if we address inequities in education, we can begin to address high unemployment that exists in Indigenous communities across Canada. We can also begin to address health, because if you identify with being treated equally in society and have equal access to employment opportunities, and society treats you well, then there's a greater probability that you will not suffer from ill health, because you will see yourself as being a contributing member of society. And this can lead to a reconciliation of past practices that nurtured the present outcomes. And I want to emphasize history because it's important for understanding how we came to be in the place that we are. And quite often, I come across an idea that individuals may feel as though they may feel guilty about the past. However, I like to say that we cannot control the past, we can only control the present and the future. And so we are directly agents of the present and agents of the future. We can choose to do something, or we can choose not to do something. We can choose to learn about it, or we can choose not to learn about it. And even when we learn about it, we can choose to actually respectfully engage with the material, or we can pass it off. And so I would challenge all of those who are listening to this presentation that one way that we can all engage in the process of reconciliation is to treat this information respectfully and to guide current actions and future actions. And I leave with this statement: to be the change that you want to see. So if you want to see changes in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada, then we have all a role to play by respectfully engaging with one another and learning from the past, and striving for a better future. Misoe, that is all. Miigwech, thank you. Bama pi minwa, until next time. And there will be a scheduled time when I can take your questions and comments, and I look forward to that. Thank you for attending my presentation.